That is actually the last song on Shlomo Katz's album, Live in Melbourne. We've been working our way through that whole album as the music for our countdown timer. So tomorrow we'll start another album. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do a little beautiful learning on a Thursday evening? We're getting near the end of this tractate. We got 1 week to go. We're getting near Rosh Hashanah, just a little over a week to go. And it's almost Shabbos. The energy is high. Melissa in Great Neck Yehuda in South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Tom in Pennsylvania, Nancy in North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, John in Maine, Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in Chicago, Yosef, I believe, in Massachusetts. Okay, I'm not sure what that is. PK in Colorado, Gwen in Michigan, Guy in Dayton, Stephen in New Hampshire, Christo in Lubbock, Paula in the Great Northwest. Great sorrow for all who died in the Kabul airport, for them and for their families. May that situation get under control soon. We need stability. We need peace. Let's dedicate today's learning to increasing the peace in the world. We could all use it. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. It's Elul. Rosh Hashanah is coming, so we blow the shofar every day in Elul. Mitzi moves into a new apartment, and she calls up her friend Esther and says, I just moved into a new apartment. Come visit me. Come and see it. Esther says, oh, I'd love to see your new apartment, Mitzi. Where is it? Mitzi says, you get off the subway at 96th Street. You come out of the station. You look down the block. You're going to see a building with a red door. You go to the red door and you ring the buzzer with your right elbow. I'll buzz you in. You open the door with your left elbow. You come into the lobby and then you summon the elevator with your right elbow. Get in the elevator, press number 7 with your left elbow. Get out on the 7th floor, walk over to 7C and knock on the door with your right elbow and I'll let you in. Esther says, Mitzi, I'm so excited to see your new apartment, but what's with all the elbows? Right elbow, left elbow, what is all that? And Mitzi says, what? You're going to come empty-handed? Why did I tell that classic Jewish joke just now? It is very relevant to what we are learning today as we open chapter 5, the final chapter here in Tractate Sukkah. We're on page 50. This tractate ends on page 56. So if all goes well, I think we'll be making a siyum next Friday. This final chapter is very much about the details of how we fulfill the obligation to rejoice. Now, we're commanded to rejoice in all the festivals, but it's even bigger on Sukkot. This is Tractate Sukkah. These are the laws of Sukkot, the 7-day festival. And we're also studying the laws of Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, which is its own festival, as we've discussed. But throughout those 7 days and then Shmini Atzeret, we are commanded to rejoice, and in a big way. Deuteronomy 16:13 through 16. You shall prepare for you the festival of Sukkot for 7 days, as you gather from your threshing floor and from your wine press. It's a fall holiday, right? You're celebrating at the time of your harvest. And you shall rejoice in your festival, you and your son and your daughter and your manservant and your maidservant and the Levite, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow that are within your gates. 7 days shall you keep a feast unto the Lord your God in the place which the Lord shall choose. Because the Lord your God shall bless you in all your increase and in all the work of your hands, and you shall be altogether joyful. 3 times a year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose, on the festival of Passover, and on Shavuos, and on Sukkot. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Okay. So let's learn more about what it means to appear before the Lord not empty-handed. There would be these pilgrimage festivals, and the people would ascend to Jerusalem. It really is a hill. You go up a hill to get to Jerusalem. Here, Mishna number 1 here in chapter 5. The flute is played on the festival of Sukkot for 5 or 6 days. This is the flute of the Beis HaShoeva, the place of drawing of the water, whose playing overrides neither Shabbos nor the festival, meaning you don't play the flute on the first day of Sukkot, which is a complete festival day, as opposed to the intermediate days of Sukkot, nor do you play this flute on Shabbos, because it's prohibited to play the flute on Shabbos and festival days, as we'll discuss, so it doesn't override neither Shabbos nor the festival days. Right? So if Shabbos comes out during one of those intermediate days of Sukkot, the flute is only going to be played 5 days. Where is the flute played? At the place of drawing the water from the Siloam pool. And as we've discussed, that water is then brought up to the temple for the water libations that are performed on the altar only during Sukkot. Therefore, if the first festival day occurred on Shabbos, they would play the flute for 6 days that year, right? Since if Shabbos and the first day of the festival were the same day, there would be 6 intermediate days that are neither Shabbos nor a festival day, and they could play the flute all 6 days. Otherwise, they would play it on 5 days. That's Mishnah number 1, short and sweet. Gemara. It was stated that Rav Yehuda and Rav Eina disagreed. One of them teaches that the celebration was called the celebration of drawing, shoeva, like drawing the water from the wells of salvation, drawing the water from a well, from a spring, drawing water, shoeva. And one of them teaches that it was called significant, chashuva, right? Chashuva. Like when we talk about, oh, he's a very chashuva yid, right? That means he's prominent or significant, right? So which is it? Is it that that this celebration was named after the drawing of the water, Hashoeva, or because it was a significant celebration, Chashuva? And Mar Zutra said, somebody who's named Mar something, is usually going to be the exilarch, meaning the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia, right, in Bavel, which at this time is actually administered by Persia. So Mar Zutra said, the one who taught Shoeva is not mistaken, and the one who taught Chashuva is not mistaken. The one who taught Shoeva is not mistaken, as it is written, and you shall draw, ushavtem, the same verb, water with joy from the wells of salvation, Isaiah 12:3. And its name reflects the fact that it is a celebration of the water libation. Says Mar Zutra, and the one who taught that it was called Chashuva is not mistaken. As Rav Nachman said, it is a significant mitzvah, and it originated from the 6 days of creation. So we have this note from Rav Steinsaltz. Rashi cites proof that the drain pipes, right? We talked about these drain pipes, these like the drain pipes in the Temple Mount that would take the liquids, receive the liquids that seeped through the altar. Remember that the altar had to be made of stones that were not cut by machine. And so it would seep through, and then there would be these drain pipes in the Temple Mount, and that those were kind of made naturally. In fact, they were made by God at the time of creation. So Rashi cites proof that the drain pipes were created during the 6 days of creation, and they were later used for the water libation. And the connection between the water libation and creation seems to be based on the Midrash that describes that the lower waters wept after being removed from the heavenly spheres on the second day of creation, right? Remember in the story in Genesis that on the second day, God created a firmament which separated the upper waters from the lower waters. We understand that as the upper waters is that spiritual realm. It's fluid-like. It has some kind of water-like quality, but it's that higher realm, right? And the lower waters are like our world, water, right? Like that would be the waters. And so, right, so the lower waters were sad, brokenhearted to be separated from that heavenly sphere, that upper realm, and God, to console them, God promised that they would be elevated through the rite of the water libation, right? And this is a very important principle. So this idea that the water was sad, we actually see that in several places in the Midrash, these kind of rabbinic stories where even, inorganic objects will express an emotion that ties into these kinds of narratives. But the sort of higher lesson of that is that the lower waters are going to be elevated when they're using the water libation. And this applies to all mitzvahs. When we do God's will, whatever object we use in performing that mitzvah, right? For example, if you give money to charity, you've elevated that money out of, and it's no longer just, some object from the material and materialistic world. You've actually now endowed it with a holy purpose. So anytime you do God's will, the instruments that enable you to perform God's will acquire holiness and a holy character, right? And that applies to us as well. We are significant beings, we're humans, we're thinking beings, we have souls, and high-level souls as opposed to the animals. Animals have animal souls. We have an animal soul and that higher soul as well. But we can be caught in, the base nature of our existence until we perform God's will. And then we elevate ourselves and everything around us that is used in performing God's will. And the Kabbalistic, sort of metaphor for that, maybe even not such a metaphor, maybe it's real, but this idea that there are holy sparks trapped all over the material world. And that was sort of the original light that God shone into the space that God created within God's self. That space is called a tzimtzum. And then God created vessels in that place, meaning the material world, the objects of the material world, the beings, the stars, the planets, the people, everything that's in this world, and then shone his light into that. But his light was just too overwhelming and powerful, and it shattered the vessels within that space. And so when the vessels shattered into, gazillion pieces, and that's what our universe looks like, right? It's a shattered world. All the stars in the Milky Way, all the galaxies, etc. It's a shattering of God's light. But bits of God's light are trapped in every object in this world. And when you elevate any object and use it for a holy purpose, it's like that spark of God's light is freed, elevated. It can return and join with the original light in heaven, right? And that is our job in this world, to elevate the whole world and everything in it into a godly place. Okay. Where am I? Okay, so the sages taught the flute overrides Shabbos. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei Bar Yehuda. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yosei, say it does not override even a festival, and how much more it does not override Shabbos. Rav Yosef said, the dispute is with regard to the song that the Levites sang accompanying the daily offering. As Rabbi Yosei Bar Yehuda holds that the primary essence of song is the accompaniment by the musical instruments, and consequently these instruments are a component of the temple service and override Shabbos. And the rabbis hold that the primary essence of song is singing with the mouth. And consequently, the instruments are not an integral component of the temple service. They merely accompany the singing on occasion, and therefore, playing the instruments doesn't override Shabbos. However, with regard to the song of the drawing of the water from the Siloam pool, which is not in the temple compound, everyone agrees that it is an aspect of rejoicing and not a component of the temple service. Therefore, it does not override Shabbos. Right? So they're talking about that there were lots of musical instruments that were played to accompany the Levites, the choir of Levites, singing in the Holy Temple. Did they play those instruments on Shabbos and Yom Tov, on Shabbos and festivals? And there's an argument about that, right? Generally speaking, there was a rabbinic decree that we don't play musical instruments on Shabbos. Why? Because you might break the instrument and come to repair the instrument, and then you would have violated Shabbos or the festival. And so to protect us from coming to commit that severe transgression, the sages decreed no musical instruments on Shabbos. We sing, we clap, we bang the tables, but we don't play instruments on Shabbos or the festival. However, there's still room for dispute here, because do rabbinic ordinances apply in the Holy Temple? The Holy Temple is administered by the priests, right? And the priests know the rules very well, what's permitted and what isn't permitted on Shabbos, etc. And so generally speaking, most rabbinic ordinances did not apply within the precincts of the Holy Temple. Some did, right? So if the sages could identify a law that even the priests were likely to end up transgressing Shabbos, they might impose such a law not only throughout anywhere where Jews live, but even in the temple itself. Most rabbinic ordinances did not. So did this rabbinic ordinance against playing musical instruments on Shabbos and Yom Tov, did it apply in the temple? And specifically, did it apply with respect to the flute? Right? The flute is singled out as the most prominent of the instruments that were played in the temple. On previous days that we've been studying together, we talked about the harps, kind of like the ancient style harp that they would use. We didn't talk about the flute. Now we're being told that the flute is actually the most prominent of those instruments, perhaps because it was a higher pitch and it could be heard very distinctly. At any rate, it's understood to be the most prominent of the instruments, and so now we're going to be talking more about that. Rav Yosef said, "From where do I say that they disagree about this matter?" They disagree. It is as it was taught in a Baraisa. With regard to temple service vessels, right? Many vessels are used in the temple. For example, anytime that an animal offering was slaughtered, right? They would cut it in a kosher manner. They would kill the animal by slaughtering it by one quick, very sharp slit through the neck. It bleeds out, it bleeds to death, and the blood, the initial gush of blood from an animal offering needs to be captured in a vessel. So that's one example of temple vessels. Other vessels, like where the priests would wash their hands, wash their feet, etc. There were many vessels that were used in the temple service, and they were all made out of metal. Some of gold, some of silver, some of copper. Could they be made out of wood? This is the question that they're actually talking about now. And why are they talking about it? Because the original flute that was used in the temple service was a flute that survived from the time of Moses, and that was a wooden flute. So a musical instrument being used in the temple has the character of a vessel being used in the temple, a utensil being used in the temple. Does it need to be made out of gold, silver, or copper? Can it be made out of wood? If it can be made out of wood, can we learn out from that other vessels could also be made out of wood? Could we use a wooden bowl as part of the temple service? This is what they're talking about. Rav Yosef said, "From where do I say that they disagree about this matter? It is as was taught in a Baraisa. With regard to temple service vessels that one crafted of wood, Rebbe, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, deems them unfit. You cannot use wooden vessels in the Holy Temple. And Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda deems them fit. And what? Is it not that they disagree with regard to the following matter? The one who deems the wooden vessel unfit, Rebbe, holds that the primary essence of song is accompaniment by musical instruments. And we derive that sacred vessels may be crafted of wood from the wooden flute of Moses, which according to this opinion was a service vessel. And the one who deems the wooden vessel unfit holds that the primary essence of song is with the mouth, and therefore we do not derive any halacha relevant to the service vessels from the wooden flute of Moses. And as according to this opinion, it was not a service vessel. And the Gemara rejects this explanation of the Baraisa. The Gemara says, no, that is not necessarily the matter that they were arguing about, as one could say that everyone agrees. The primary essence of song is singing accompanied by musical instruments. And here, with regard to whether one derives the possible from the impossible, that is what they disagree on. Can one establish a principle that applies in all cases based on a case with a unique aspect? The one who deems wooden service vessels fit for use in the temple holds that one may derive the possible, i.e., what are the temple service vessels going to be made out of? We can derive a rule from that, with respect to that, from the impossible, i.e., the flute of Moses. Although there was no alternative to crafting the flute of Moses from wood, there was no alternative to making it from wood, you had to make it from wood, one may derive from this that the sacred vessels, even when the alternative to craft them from metal exists, may be crafted from wood. And the one who deems wooden service vessels unfit for use in the Holy Temple holds that one may not derive the possible from the impossible. Right? What's impossible? So you can't make the flute of Moses from gold. It can only be made out of wood because there was only one such flute. And so the sages explain the flute of Moses. It is related that in the temple there remained one flute from the days of Moses that was crafted from a wooden reed. In deference to the glory of the holy temple, the overseers of the temple sought to plate that wooden flute with gold. However, once they did so, they discovered that the sound that the flute produced was no longer as pleasant, and so they removed the gold plating. Therefore, there was one temple vessel made completely of wood, the flute of Moses. So the question is, well, we have no alternative but to keep that wooden flute in its original form as a temple. It's serving as a temple vessel, and it's made of wood. It has to be made of wood. Can we learn out from that other temple vessels may be made of wood? Here's a wooden vessel, so we can make other vessels of wood. Or do we say that, well, there's no alternative but to make the flute of keep the flute of Moses as a wooden vessel, but we cannot learn out from that other vessels could also be made out of wood? And that is what they are disagreeing about. And it makes sense why they would disagree about it. Now, it's a really nice lesson that we should just pause and absorb. You got a wooden flute. It was old. It produced a beautiful sound, a pleasing melody to the priests, to the visitors to the temple, to God. And then they tried to make it better. Like, oh, we know better. Let's make it glorious. Let's make it out of gold, or let's plate it with gold. And when they did that, it sounded terrible. I said, we made a mistake, and they took the gold plating off. How often in life do we arrive at a situation which is great, and then somebody wants to perfect it, and then they ruin it, right? That's an old saying, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So let's remember that, and here's a beautiful illustration of that principle. All right, so we're continuing with this argument. Can we learn out from the wooden flute of Moses that other vessels in the temple could also be made out of wood? Also, that flute, is it really a service vessel in the temple? Part of that argument is, well, what is the essential component in terms of the music that was heard in the temple? Is it the voices of the Levites, and then the instruments are just an accompaniment? Or is it like the band, the Levites who are playing instruments, that's the main thing of the music, and the ones who are, humming along or singing along, they're the accompaniment. It's hard to say one is more important than the other. We're just accustomed to, the idea that bands both sing and play instruments. But is one more significant than the other? If so, then the other one is not something that we can learn legal principles from that. And if you wish, say instead, in rejection of Rav Yosef's proof that everyone agrees that the primary essence of song is singing with the mouth, and one does not derive the possible from the impossible. And here, with regard to deriving the laws of the temple candelabrum, meaning the menorah, the 7-branched golden menorah that stood in the temple, by means of the hermeneutic principle. Now, one of the ways that the sages learned out laws from, the very terse, short laws that are in the Torah, and they needed to establish legal principles that would cover many, many other situations that were not detailed in the Torah. And so they have very systematic methods for deriving laws, sort of ancillary laws, from those terse and summarized written laws in the Torah. Right? Some that we've already seen is like a kal v'chomer, where, if we have a restriction in a very obvious case where, that's going to be restricted, then in another case where clearly we need a restriction, all the more so you're going to have that restriction. Or sometimes we say, well, a law applies in this situation, and the word that's used in that law also appears with respect to this other situation, and we're going to, learn out that law for to the second situation because there's a common word in both places. So there are techniques like that. There's 13 principles, 13 hermeneutic principles. They're actually in any Jewish prayer book. The 13 hermeneutic principles as laid out by Rabbi Yishmael, right? So you can find that in any prayer book. So here, they're going to disagree on which of those principles they're going to use. And here, with regard to deriving laws with respect to the menorah in the Holy Temple, we can use either generalizations and details, or we can use the principle of amplifications and restrictions. And this is what they're disagreeing about. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi interprets verses by means of the principle of generalizations and details, and Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda interprets verses by means of the principle of amplifications and restrictions. And now we'll see how that works. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi interprets the verse, Exodus 25:31, and you shall make the menorah of pure gold. Of beaten work shall the menorah be made. Okay, so the way that it's phrased is very specific, and the sages are going to learn out from that exact wording a principle. What do they learn? So when it starts and says, and you shall make a menorah, this is a generalization, as the material of the menorah has not been specified. Then the verse says, pure gold. This is a detail, limiting the materials that can be used to make the menorah exclusively to gold. But then it says, of beaten work shall the menorah be made. And the verse has generalized again. The result is a generalization and a detail and a generalization, from which you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail. Just as the detail is explicit that the menorah must be crafted from gold, which is a metal, so too all other materials used in crafting the menorah must be metal. Since the menorah is the prototype for all temple service vessels, we learn out from that all of the service vessels in the temple must be made of metal. We don't learn that they must be made of gold. That detail applies to the menorah. But the detail does teach us that they must be made of metal. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, however, who deems that wooden temple vessels are unfit, he interprets verses by means of the principle of amplifications and restrictions. So he reads that same verse, and you shall make a menorah. This is an amplification, as the material of the menorah is not specified. Pure gold, that's a restriction, limiting the material exclusively to gold. Of beaten work shall the menorah be made. Now the verse repeated and amplified. The result is an amplification, a restriction, and an amplification. How is this different than a generalization, a detail, and a generalization? Here, in the case of the amplification, restriction, amplification, one derives to amplify all items except for those most dissimilar to the restriction. What did the verse amplify? It amplified all materials, even wood. And what did the verse exclude with this restriction? It excluded a menorah crafted from earthenware. You can't make a menorah from earthenware, but you could make it out of wood, it would seem. Here's Rav Stein, and then I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. Here's Rav Steinsaltz's note about generalization, detail, generalization versus amplification, restriction, amplification. These two hermeneutical principles, associated with the schools of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, respectively, fundamentally disagree with regard to whether general statements are considered generalizations or whether they are considered amplifications, and with regard to whether specific statements are considered details or whether they are considered restrictions. The opinion that considers the general statements to be generalizations creates logical categories relating to the nature of the matter under discussion, and even more so based on the specific examples, i.e. the details cited in that context. In contrast, the opinion that considers the generalizations to be amplifications and specifics to be restrictions has its own logic. The generalization is an indication that this topic has universal applicability, and the specific is an indication that there is a specific restriction to that general applicability. Consequently, employing the methodology of amplification and restriction always results in a more inclusive conclusion than does the methodology of generalization and detail. In the latter methodology, the detail limits applicability of the generalization to one particular detail, meaning it won't apply to this detail, while in the former methodology, it indicates merely an exception to the general principle. Therefore, when implementing the methodology of amplification and restriction, the detail furthest removed from generality is excluded, leaving the principle virtually intact. That is not easy to understand. I just wanted to introduce you to the hermeneutical principles that the sages used. When you take a high-level Gemara shir, then you really get into the nitty-gritty of how those hermeneutical principles work. For now, all you really have to, all I want you to get from that, if you find it confusing, is this idea that the sages were very methodical in how they would create laws or make ordinances. It's not just the simple principle of to keep us from violating Shabbos or to keep us from violating some other Torah law. There were certain situations where they needed a legal principle, and it wasn't just about keeping us from violating something, a broad category. It just wasn't clear how people were supposed to conduct themselves, and they needed some kind of a system for creating laws out of the Torah. Not just, hey, we're the sages and we think this is how it should be. It wasn't just a policy argument. They had this strict methodology, and there were a little bit differences in the methodology, but the biggest sort of creators of those methodologies were Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, let's go to comments and questions. Google signed me out. I am signing in. This is the document that Nina uses to communicate to me which questions I should answer. Let's welcome new viewer, Cynthia Gabrielle. Welcome, Cynthia. It's great to have you with us. We hope you'll come back and learn many times. We're on every day, and with God's help, we'll finish the whole Talmud. It's a 7.5-year project. We began in January of 2020. Here we are in August of 2021. So it's been going about a year and a half. So that means we have about 6 years to go in our daily class. Yosef says, doesn't Moshe mean drawn out in Egyptian, right? His name Moshe, it says in the Torah, he was named that because Pharaoh's daughter pulled him out of the water. Is there a relation? Does that sound Moshe and Shoeva? I don't know if it's the same. I don't know if the word roots are related. As you say, that was a meaning in Egyptian, whatever the language was that they were speaking in Egypt back then. But you're correct that is, how he got his name. He was drawn out of the water, right? And so this idea that something significant happens when we draw the water out of the Siloam pool for those water libations of Sukkot, it's important. And as we mentioned, there's celebrations of great joy. This chapter is going to be all about that rejoicing. This chapter will also cover the offerings of Sukkot. Specifically, there were 70 bulls. I think 14 on the first day, 13 on the second day, 12 on the third day, etc. I don't know if they started 14 or 13. I thought it was 14. At any rate, it adds up to 70, the bulls that are sacrificed during Sukkot when the temple was standing. The number 70 is a significant number. What it relates to is that in ancient times, it was understood that there were 70 nations in the world, right? When did the 70 nations come into being? After the Tower of Babel, right? When everybody had the same language, then God said the humans are getting arrogant. He destroyed the Tower of Babel, right? And then mixed up the humans with new languages, and they became separate peoples. 70 nations. So when we say that 70 bulls are offered during Sukkot, that is why Sukkot is considered the most universal of the Jewish holidays, meaning that we're bringing offerings not just on behalf of the Jewish people, but on behalf of the whole world, right? The 70 bulls are an offering on behalf of all the nations of the world. And with God's help, when the Messiah comes, right, we'll all sing and dance, right, in Jerusalem, Jews and non-Jews together. Sharon Frant Brooks. He was given, answering this question, he was given a Hebrew name from the Hebrew Meshitihu, drew him out of the water, although named by Pharaoh's daughter. Wonder what he was called by his mother Yocheved during his first 3 months of life. I would like to know that too. If somebody has a midrash on that, I'd like to hear it. Bill, I think I'd be worried about a wooden menorah. Very good. Or any wooden oil lamp, really. What would stop it from catching fire after all? Right. I mean, certainly you can't have a wooden menorah. Any of the principal service vessels can't be made out of wood. That wooden flute had to remain wood. Could something else be used, right? Could something else be used? Sharon, the oil lamps can be made of glass and the wicks floated in that. And Bill, yes, I suppose that would work. But, and I would be misremembering here, isn't the menorah meant to be all of one piece? For sure, the menorah was made of gold. The menorah was made of gold and hammered work, right? It had to be all like one piece of gold, as you're saying. And by the way, you can see that I think the Temple Institute, the Third Temple Institute in Jerusalem, it used to be in a public place, and I think now, I'm not sure where it is, but they made, like a big golden menorah, sort of preparing for when the Messiah comes. At least we'll have the menorah already. It was more like a learning tool. I think that when God sends the Messiah and the third temple is going to go up in one day, that's what our tradition says. It won't be like a years-long project of building the temple. God will build it in one day, and probably all the service vessels will come with it, including the proper menorah. Maybe the original menorah will be brought back. Who knows? That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. The regular Friday time is noon Pacific. The regular Saturday night time is about an hour after Shabbos ends here in Los Angeles. Maybe I can even get it sooner. So, the Saturday night class will start somewhere between 9 and 9:15, probably 9:30 at the latest Saturday night. And as Shabbos ends earlier and earlier, we're in the declining days of the year in terms of the lengths of days. It'll get easier and easier for the East Coast people to tune in on Saturday night. All the best. Have a great night.